The human firewall. Opening, rethinking the weakest link. There is a phrase that gets repeated in security so often it has calcified into something close to folk wisdom. Humans are the weakest link. You will hear it in vendor pitches, in awareness training kickoffs, in post-incident reviews where someone clicked a link they should not have clicked. And on the surface, it is not wrong. Humans do click things. They do get fooled. They do write passwords on sticky notes and prop doors open for someone carrying a heavy box. But sit with that phrase for a moment longer, and you start to notice what it does to the way an organization thinks. If humans are the weakest link, the only sensible response is to root around them. Automate everything, restrict everything, treat the workforce as a liability to be minimized rather than a capability to be developed. And that instinct, followed far enough, produces exactly the brittle, over-controlled environments that push people toward shadow IT and workarounds. There is a different way to frame the same set of facts. Humans are not just a point of failure. They are also, uniquely among every control you will ever deploy, capable of noticing something is wrong even when nothing in the logs says so. A firewall cannot tell you that a phone call felt off. An intrusion detection system cannot notice that the person walking through the loading dock without a badge was wearing the wrong kind of shoes for a delivery driver. A SIM cannot feel the particular flavor of urgency in an email that claims to be from the CEO. People can. That instinct, that discomfort, that pause before clicking, it is a detection capability. And detection capabilities can be trained, measured, and improved like any other control. This is the idea we are going to spend this session with, the human firewall. Not humans as the weakest link technology has to compensate for, but humans as sensors, a distributed, always-on detection layer that happens to run on judgment instead of signatures. The tension we are going to keep returning to is this one. Sensors are only useful if the signal they produce is trusted, acted on quickly, and not drowned out by noise. Build that trust and response loop well, and you have added a detection capability no technology can replicate. Build it poorly, and you have a workforce that either stops reporting or reports everything, and either failure mode quietly undoes the entire investment. The foundation. Why weakest link was only half the story. Let's start with why the human element earns its reputation. Social engineering is the deliberate manipulation of a person into performing an action or divulging information that compromises security, and it works because it does not attack a system. It attacks a set of very normal human instincts. The desire to be helpful, the reluctance to seem rude or paranoid, the deference most people extend to authority, urgency, and familiarity. A phishing email is the most common form, a message designed to look like it comes from a trusted source, engineered to provoke a click, a credential entry, or an attachment open. But phishing is only one branch of a much larger tree. Pretexting builds an entire false scenario, someone claiming to be from the bank, from IT, from a vendor you actually work with, to extract information or access under a plausible story. Baiting dangles something appealing, a free USB drive left in a parking lot, a too-good-to-be-true download, and lets curiosity do the rest. Tailgating is the physical version of the same principle. Someone in business casual, carrying a coffee and a laptop bag, walking confidently through a badge access door right behind an employee who holds it open because refusing to would feel awkward. What unites all of these is that they are not exploiting a vulnerability in software. They are exploiting a vulnerability in social convention. And that is precisely why the weakest link framing, taken alone, leads nowhere useful. You cannot patch a person's inclination to be polite. You cannot deploy an update that removes deference to authority. What you can do is give people the specific pattern recognition to notice when politeness, urgency, or authority is being weaponized against them. and then give them somewhere fast and low friction to say, something about this felt wrong. This is where the reframe earns its keep. If you accept that social engineering will always find a percentage of people in any sufficiently large organization on any given day, and it will, because the attack surface is human psychology itself, and psychology does not get security patches, then your objective shifts. It is no longer prevent every single successful manipulation. It becomes detect the manipulation attempt as early and as often as possible, and get that signal to the people who can act on it before the damage compounds. That is a fundamentally different design goal, and it is the one an Information Security Management System, or ISMS, is built to support. An ISMS is the structured, documented framework, policies, risk assessments, control objectives, continuous improvement cycles, frameworks like ISO 27001, that ties people, process, and technology together into something coherent rather than three departments doing three unrelated things. The human firewall does not work as a slogan. It works as a program, with a defined reporting mechanism, defined roles, defined metrics, and a defined feedback loop, sitting inside that broader ISMS structure the same way a firewall rule set sits inside a network security policy. The structural tension, sensitivity versus trust. Every sensor, whether it is silicon or human, has to be tuned. Tune it too loosely and it misses real threats. Tune it too tightly and it drowns everyone in false positives until they stop paying attention to it entirely. This is the central tension of the human firewall, and it plays out in almost exactly the same shape as alert fatigue in a SOC, except the sensor here has feelings, a workload, and a limited tolerance for being made to feel stupid. Push training too hard toward suspicion. Teach people to distrust every unusual request. Flag every unfamiliar caller, question every urgent email, and you get two failure modes simultaneously. The first is a flood of reports for entirely legitimate activity. The new vendor calling to confirm an invoice, the executive genuinely working late, and sending an unusual request, the IT team running a real password reset campaign that happens to resemble the phishing simulation from last month. When the reporting channel fills with noise, the people triaging it, often a SOC analyst or a security awareness manager, cannot find the real signal inside it, and the entire mechanism becomes a widely ignored formality. The second failure mode is subtler and more corrosive. Employees start to feel that security is asking them to be suspicious of their own colleagues and normal business processes, and that suspicion becomes exhausting. Exhausted sensors disengage. Push training too soft in the other direction. Reassure people, avoid alarming language, keep the messaging friendly and infrequent, and the sensor simply never fires. People see a slightly off email and shrug. They see someone without a badge and assume someone else will handle it. The phishing call that asks for a password sounds plausible enough that nobody feels the friction required to say no. The resolution is not a single dial you set once. It is a designed pathway that separates two very different actions, raising a hand and sounding an alarm. If the only mechanism you give people is escalate this as a security incident, you have built a system that only tolerates high-confidence reports, and low-confidence unease has nowhere to go except back into silence. What the human firewall actually needs is a low-friction, low-stakes, is this real? Channel, a quick-check line, a dedicated Slack channel, a one-click report button that does not require the reporter to first convince themselves the threat is genuine, sitting alongside the formal incident escalation path. That structural separation is what lets sensitivity stay high without trust collapsing under a barrage of false positives, because the person doing the reporting never has to bear the full weight of being wrong. The architectural philosophy, distributed detection by design. If you take the sensor framing seriously, it starts to reshape how you architect the program, not just how you write the training slides. A distributed detection network, which is really what a well-run security awareness program is, needs the same three things any distributed sensor network needs. Broad coverage, a low-latency reporting path back to a central point that can correlate signals, and enough local expertise that the sensors themselves can do a first pass of triage before anything reaches the center. Broad coverage in this context means the entire workforce, not just the people already inclined to care about security. This is why a security champion program matters architecturally rather than just symbolically. Placing a designated security ambassador inside every department, someone in finance, someone in HR, someone on the loading dock team, decentralizes the expertise that would otherwise live only inside the security team itself. That local champion becomes a first line of interpretation. A colleague can ask them, "Is this normal?" Faster and with less friction than filing a formal report, and the champion can escalate the genuinely interesting cases upward. This mirrors exactly the architectural logic of deploying sensors at the edge of a network, rather than relying solely on a centralized inspection point. You catch things closer to where they happen, and you reduce the load on the center. The low-latency reporting path is the phishing report button and its physical world equivalents. The design goal here is to reduce the number of decisions a person has to make before they report something. A button embedded directly in the email client, requiring one click, turns, "I think this might be phishing," into a 2-second action rather than a 5-minute detour through a help desk ticketing system that most people will simply not bother with under normal workload pressure. Every additional step in a reporting path is a point where a legitimate signal gets abandoned. And the correlation function, the reason all of this matters architecturally and not just as a feel-good culture initiative, is that a single user report is a data point, but 100 reports of the same suspicious sender within a 10-minute window is a campaign. This is precisely the same architectural logic as a SIM correlating individual events into a pattern that no single log line would reveal on its own. The human firewall, architected correctly, feeds a correlation engine exactly like any other telemetry source does. It just happens that the agent collecting the telemetry is a person deciding whether an email felt right. The tool examination, what each control actually buys you. Let's walk through the tools that materially enforce this model, because each one represents a specific trade-off, and none of them is free. The phishing report button is the most visible piece of the architecture. What it provides is exactly what we described above, a near-frictionless path from suspicion to signal embedded at the moment of exposure. What it costs is not primarily financial. Most email platforms offer this natively or through a modest add-on, but organizational. It costs triage capacity. Every report generated has to be looked at by someone, and if the button is successful at driving high report volume, that volume needs a proportional investment in the people or automation reviewing it. What it cannot do on its own is improve accuracy. A report button captures volume, not quality. Without training that teaches people what they are actually looking for, the button becomes a funnel for noise as easily as for signal. It is a delivery mechanism, not a detection capability by itself. The Security Champion program provides decentralized expertise, and just as importantly, decentralized ownership. Security stops being something that happens to a department and starts being something a peer inside that department actively participates in. What it costs is time from people whose primary job is not security, and that time has to be genuinely protected, not just nominally granted, or the program collapses into a title with no substance behind it the moment a real deadline arrives. What it cannot do is substitute for actual security expertise on complex matters. A champion in the marketing department can spot an unusual request and escalate it well. They cannot be expected to assess the technical severity of a credential compromise, and a program that leans on champions past that boundary is asking amateurs to make professional judgment calls. Gamified training, leaderboards, point systems, recognition for reporting provides engagement, which is the single hardest thing to manufacture in mandatory compliance training. People who are engaged pay attention. People who are enduring a checkbox exercise do not. What it costs is the risk of perverse incentives. If the metric being gamified is raw report volume, you will get raw report volume, including a wave of reports on entirely benign internal emails from people chasing a leaderboard position. The design has to reward accuracy and thoughtful judgment, not just activity, or the gamification actively degrades signal quality even while it improves participation. What it cannot do is replace the underlying content. A well-gamified but shallow training program produces people who are good at the game, and only incidentally better at recognizing an actual threat. Physical security awareness training, particularly around tailgating, provides something the other tools do not: coverage of the non-digital attack surface. Physical access is often functionally equivalent to root access. Someone standing at an unlocked workstation or plugged into an internal network port has bypassed a huge amount of the technical control stack in one step. What it costs is social discomfort, and this cost is significant and often underestimated. Asking an employee to challenge a stranger, "I'm sorry, can I see your badge?" asks them to risk an awkward, potentially confrontational interaction with someone who might turn out to be a legitimate visitor, a new hire, or a contractor nobody told them about. Training that does not explicitly address this discomfort, give people a scripted, low-confrontation way to ask the question, and back them up organizationally when they do ask it, will produce a policy that exists on paper and gets ignored in the hallway. What it cannot do is work if leadership does not visibly model it. If executives are seen holding doors and waving people through without badges, no amount of training language will overcome what people watch their leaders actually do. Depth, building the reporting mechanism and the champion program. Let's take two of these and work through what actually implementing them involves, because the gap between "we should have a report button" and a functioning program is wider than it looks from the outside. Start with the internal reporting mechanism for suspicious emails. The obvious piece is the button itself, a one-click add-in that forwards the message, with headers intact, to a designated inbox or directly into a SOAR-connected intake queue. But the button is the smallest part of the design. The harder questions are about what happens in the 60 seconds after someone clicks it, because that is where trust is either built or destroyed. The first design decision is acknowledgement. The moment a report is submitted, the reporter should receive some confirmation that it was received, not a full resolution, just a signal that the action registered. Silence after a report is the single fastest way to teach people that reporting is pointless. And we will come back to exactly this failure mode in the troubleshooting section, because it is common enough to deserve a full worked scenario rather than a passing mention. The second design decision is triage speed and classification. Reports need to be automatically enriched where possible, sender reputation, whether the same message has been reported by others, whether the URLs inside it match known indicators, so that a human analyst is not starting from zero on every single ticket. High-confidence malicious reports should route to immediate containment action, pulling the message from other inboxes it was delivered to, blocking the sender, and alerting anyone who may have already interacted with it. Low-confidence or clearly benign reports should still get a response, Even if that response is simply, "Thanks," this one was legitimate, because that response is itself training. It teaches the reporter what real phishing looks like by contrast, and it closes the loop that keeps the sensor calibrated. The third design decision is metrics. You want to track report volume over time, but volume alone tells you very little. What matters more is the ratio of true positives to total reports, because that ratio tells you whether your sensors are well calibrated or simply noisy. And you want to track time to acknowledgement and time to resolution on reports, because a slow response loop is what breaks trust in the mechanism even when the underlying detection is sound. Now consider the Security Champion program, because it forces a different set of implementation questions. This one is organizational and political as much as procedural. Selecting champions is the first fork in the road. The temptation is to pick the people already most interested in security, but that produces a program that reinforces an existing bubble rather than expanding coverage. A stronger approach selects for influence and trust within a department, the person colleagues already go to with questions, even if that person starts with limited security background, because the champion role is fundamentally about being a trusted local point of contact. And expertise can be built through direct enablement from the security team far more easily than trust can be manufactured. Once selected, champions need genuine investment, a defined time allocation that their manager has agreed to and that shows up in their actual workload expectations. A direct line to the security team that is faster than the standard employee channel, and visibility into upcoming security initiatives before the rest of the organization, so they can answer questions credibly rather than being caught flat-footed. Without that investment, the program becomes a list of names on an internal wiki page that nobody actually uses, and it will quietly die the first time a champion's real job pulls them away and nobody notices the gap. The troubleshooting layer, when the sensor network breaks. Understanding the architecture is one thing. Recognizing when it has quietly stopped working is the harder and more valuable skill, because these failures rarely announce themselves. They show up as declining report volume or as a specific incident that reveals the mechanism was never really functioning the way anyone assumed. Let's work through 3 of these in the way you would actually have to diagnose them, not just name them. The first scenario is the 2-day silence. An employee reports a suspicious email through the proper channel. The button works, the report goes through, everything on the technical side functions correctly. Then nothing happens. No acknowledgement, no follow-up. 2 days pass, and out of a mixture of boredom, curiosity, and the simple fact that nobody told them not to, the employee clicks the link they had originally been suspicious enough to report. Diagnosing this does not start with the employee's decision to click. It starts with the queue. The first thing to check is where the report actually landed. Is it going into a monitored inbox, or into a queue that was set up during initial rollout and has since been deprioritized as the team's attention moved to louder, more visible alerts? In a lot of real environments, the phishing report inbox is treated as lower priority than SIM-generated alerts precisely, because it is just a user report rather than a technically validated detection, and that prioritization inversion is itself the root cause. A queue that nobody owns with a defined SLA will decay silently, because nothing forces attention back to it the way a critical SIM alert does. The second thing to check is whether an acknowledgement step exists at all in the workflow. If the only communication loop is report goes in and someone eventually looks at it, there is no mechanism forcing a fast first response, and the absence of that mechanism is a design gap, not a one-off staffing failure. The fix is not simply tell the analyst to be faster. The fix is architectural. An automated acknowledgement fires the moment a report lands. A defined SLA commonly measured in hours, not days, governs when a human response is expected. And that SLA is tracked as a metric the same way METT is tracked for SIM alerts. Because from the sensor's perspective, an unacknowledged report and an unacknowledged critical alert produce the identical failure. Something real got missed while sitting in a queue nobody was watching. The deeper lesson here is that the human firewall is not just a detection layer. It is a two-way channel, and a channel that only carries traffic in one direction stops being trusted almost immediately. The reporter needs to feel that reporting produced an effect, or the entire premise that their vigilance matters quietly erodes, one silent report at a time, until report volume declines and nobody upstream notices why. The second scenario is the gateway bypass. A phishing email successfully lands in inboxes across the organization despite the sending domain being on a known block list. The technical control, the secure email gateway, failed. The question the troubleshooting process needs to answer is not just, why did the gateway miss it? Although that matters too and deserves its own investigation into rule configuration, block list update timing, and whether the sender domain was newly registered and simply had not propagated into the reputation feed yet. The question that matters most for this session is, did the human firewall catch what the technical firewall missed? If the answer is yes, multiple employees reported the same email through the phishing button within minutes of delivery. That is evidence the layered model is working exactly as intended. The technical control failed, and the human control caught the gap, which is the entire argument for building a human sensor layer in the first place. No single control, technical or human, is expected to catch everything, and the layers exist precisely to cover each other's blind spots. The follow-up work here is validating that the correlation happened fast enough. Did the volume of reports get recognized as a campaign quickly? Or did each report get triaged individually as an isolated case, missing the pattern that a human analyst or a SOAR playbook should have caught by the third or fourth nearly identical report? If the answer is no, the email bypassed the gateway and nobody reported it, and it was only discovered later through a different channel, like a fraud report or a compromised account investigation. That is a much more serious finding. It means the human sensor layer did not fire even when directly exposed to a real threat, and the diagnostic process needs to shift entirely toward the training and culture layer rather than the technical one. Were the training examples people had seen recent and realistic, or stale and generic? Was the specific pretext used in this email one that training had ever covered? Was there a recent, high-volume gamified campaign that had, ironically, trained fatigue rather than vigilance, teaching people that everything looks suspicious, and thereby teaching them to stop noticing what genuinely was? The third scenario is high click rates despite ongoing training, and this is the one that most directly exposes miscalibration. An organization has been running phishing simulations and awareness training consistently, and the click rate on simulated phishing tests remains stubbornly around 40%, showing no meaningful improvement quarter over quarter. The instinct is to conclude that training does not work, or that this particular workforce is simply not receptive. Neither conclusion is usually correct, and jumping to either one skips the actual diagnostic work. The first thing to examine is the content itself against what a real attacker would actually send. A common failure is that simulated phishing campaigns become formulaic. The same visual style, the same handful of pretexts, the same sender pattern, to the point where employees start recognizing the simulation specifically, rather than developing the general pattern recognition needed to catch a real, varied attack. If click rates are low on simulations, but a real incident still succeeds, that is a strong signal the training taught pattern matching to the test, rather than genuine red flag literacy. The second thing to examine is timing and framing. Training delivered as an annual, mandatory, lengthy module that people click through to satisfy a compliance requirement produces almost no retention, regardless of how good the content is, because it is disconnected from the moment it would actually be useful. Contrast that with training delivered in short, frequent intervals, ideally triggered close to relevant moments. A brief module immediately following someone's click on a simulation, when the failure is fresh and specific, rather than in a generic session months removed from any concrete example. The third thing to examine, and the one most often skipped, is whether the organization has created a shame dynamic around clicking. If employees who click a simulated phishing email are publicly named, or face any implication of punishment, the rational response is not improved vigilance. It is concealment. People stop reporting their own mistakes, stop asking, "Is this real?" out of fear of looking foolish if it turns out to be nothing, and the entire sensor network's willingness to surface uncertainty collapses under the weight of reputational risk. The fix here is almost always cultural before it is technical. Reframe clicking a simulation as a normal, expected part of a learning process. Remove any individual-level punitive consequence, and redirect the energy of the program toward making the low confidence, "Is this real?" question feel completely safe to ask, because a workforce afraid to ask that question has already stopped being a sensor network at all. The job role lens, 3 different relationships to the same sensor network. The human firewall does not look the same from every seat in the organization, and understanding those differences matters both for building the program correctly and for recognizing which questions belong to which role in an interview setting. The Security Awareness Manager experiences this model at the design and culture layer, months before any individual incident occurs. Their job is to build the conditions under which the sensor network functions at all, designing the training content, structuring the champion program, setting the tone that determines whether reporting a mistake feels safe or shameful. When a department head flatly refuses to participate in mandatory training, calling it irrelevant to their team's work, the awareness manager cannot simply escalate that as a compliance violation and move on, because a mandated but resented training slot produces exactly the disengaged, checkbox-clicking behavior the entire program is trying to avoid. The real work is diagnostic and relational. Understanding specifically why the department head sees it as irrelevant. Is the content genuinely mismatched to their team's actual risk exposure? A factory floor team getting training built around office phishing scenarios, for instance, and then either adapting the content to be visibly relevant to that team's actual work, or building executive sponsorship that makes participation a clear organizational expectation rather than an optional courtesy. This is a slow-moving, structural relationship with the mental model, measured in quarters, not minutes. The security analyst at an MSSP or MDR provider experiences the same model at the customer configuration layer. When onboarding a new customer to a managed detection service, one of the less obvious but genuinely important pieces of context to gather is not just the customer's technology stack, but their human reporting maturity. Do they have an existing phishing report mechanism? And if so, does it feed into anything the MSSP can ingest as a telemetry source? A customer's own employees reporting a suspicious call or email is a uniquely valuable, high-context signal that a purely external threat intelligence feed cannot replicate, because it is grounded in specific, real knowledge of that customer's normal business relationships. Building alerting logic that incorporates a customer's human-sourced reports alongside honeypot-derived intelligence and standard endpoint telemetry means the analyst is treating the customer's own workforce as an extension of the detection stack, not a separate, disconnected concern. This role experiences the human firewall as one input among several, and the skill lies in correlating it meaningfully rather than treating it as either the primary signal or an afterthought. The SOC analyst at L2 or L3 experiences the model in real time. At the moment, a human-generated report becomes a ticket that has to be triaged alongside everything else in the queue. This is the sharpest, most time-pressured relationship to the mental model of the three. A daily SOC metrics report that includes user-reported incidents alongside automated detections is not just an operational nicety. It is how the SOC actually measures whether the human sensor layer is contributing meaningfully or being ignored. If user reports show a high true positive rate, but are consistently slower to acknowledge than automated alerts, that gap is a direct, measurable signal that the human channel is under-resourced relative to its actual value, and the fix belongs at the process level, not by asking individual analysts to simply work faster. This role also carries the specific burden of the acknowledgement gap we walked through earlier. The analyst who is buried in a shared queue during a busy shift is the person whose two-day silence, however unintentional, teaches a reporting employee that their instinct did not matter. Case scenario: the phishing call and the 20 people who hung up. Let's bring all of this together the way the source scenario frames it, but worked through with the full weight of everything we have covered, because the value of a capstone is in seeing the mechanism actually operate under pressure rather than in the abstract. A mid-sized company has spent the last year building exactly the kind of human firewall program described throughout this session. A phishing report button embedded in the email client with a sub-hour acknowledgement SLA, a security champion in every major department, quarterly training refreshed with realistic, varied pretexts rather than a single annual module, and critically, following the resolution from our earlier troubleshooting discussion, an explicit, communicated policy that clicking a simulation or asking, "Is this real?" carries zero individual consequence. Into this environment, an attacker launches a targeted phishing campaign. The attacker has done reconnaissance, likely from a combination of LinkedIn, the company website, and possibly a prior data breach, and knows enough to sound credible. An internal-sounding extension number spoofed on caller ID, the name of an actual person on the real IT team, and a plausible pretext about a sync issue that requires the target to confirm their password to resolve. The first call lands on a junior clerk in HR. This is not an accident of targeting. Junior staff in departments outside of IT and security are a common target precisely because they are less likely to have deep technical training and more likely to feel deference toward a caller claiming IT authority. Here is where the constraint that makes this scenario worth examining actually bites. The clerk has no way to independently verify, in the 60 seconds of that phone call, whether the caller is legitimate. There is no badge to check, no email header to inspect, no second channel readily available mid-conversation. The decision has to be made on judgment alone, under exactly the social pressure, helpfulness, deference to authority, the awkwardness of refusing a colleague-sounding request, that social engineering is built to exploit. The training holds. The clerk recalls a specific, concrete red flag drilled into the program. Legitimate IT will never ask for a password directly, full stop, no exceptions, no urgent sync issue changes that rule. The clerk says no, and importantly, because of the earlier design work around psychological safety, does not simply hang up and privately worry about whether they overreacted. They use the quick check hotline, the low-stakes channel that exists specifically so uncertainty has somewhere safe to go, to ask the security team whether this was legitimate. The response from the SOC has to happen fast, and this is where the metrics and process work done earlier pays off directly. The analyst on shift does not treat this as an isolated, low-priority curiosity. They recognize the shape of a phishing attempt against IT credentials, and rather than waiting to see if more reports trickle in organically, they proactively broadcast an alert across the company describing the specific pretext, the caller ID pattern, the sync issue language, the impersonated internal team, so that anyone who receives a similar call over the following hours or days recognizes it immediately rather than encountering it cold. This step matters enormously and is easy to skip under time pressure. A single report, correctly triaged and rapidly broadcast, effectively immunizes the rest of the organization against the same attack pattern before it has a chance to spread. The attacker calls 20 more people over the following hours. Every one of them hangs up. Not because each of those 20 independently possessed exceptional judgment, but because the human firewall functioned exactly as an architected sensor network is supposed to function. One sensor detected an anomaly, reported it through a low-friction channel. The report was correlated and acted on quickly by the humans monitoring that channel, and the resulting alert propagated outward faster than the attacker could propagate their campaign. The trade-off that made this possible was paid well before the attack ever happened: the investment in training time, the tolerance for the operational cost of a quick-check channel that would inevitably field some number of false alarms, the discipline of treating a single human report with the same triage urgency as an automated SIM alert. None of that investment shows up as a line item that prevents an intrusion in a way anyone can point to directly. It shows up exactly like this, as 20 phone calls that went nowhere and an incident report that describes an attack contained rather than an attack that succeeded. Closing the sensor you already have. Every organization already owns this sensor network. It exists the moment you have a workforce, whether or not you have ever formally acknowledged it, trained it, or built a channel for it to report through. The question was never whether to have a human firewall. It was always whether to leave it uncalibrated, unheard, and quietly degrading, or to treat it with the same design discipline you would bring to any other detection capability you were deploying across your environment. That discipline means resisting the temptation to measure success by volume alone, because a loud sensor network is not the same as an accurate one. It means building the feedback loop as carefully as you build the reporting button, because a sensor that reports into silence stops reporting. It means understanding that psychological safety is not a soft add-on to the program, but a load-bearing part of its architecture. Because fear is the single fastest way to turn a distributed detection network back into a liability everyone is trying to hide from. The next time someone in your organization pauses before clicking, picks up a hotline instead of a link, or stops a stranger in a hallway to ask about a badge, remember what that pause actually is. It is not luck, and it is not an exception to the rule that people are the weakest link. It is a sensor firing exactly as designed, in a network you built, whether you meant to or not. Your job is to make sure it was built well enough to be trusted the next time it fires.